Alright, so it's about time we talk about the self-destructive nature of Evergreen MMOs. While I'm sure most of you know, Evergreen is designed that content and most importantly gear and progression stay relevant for a long time and mostly basically forever, or at least until the content is so old people stop caring about it. The allure of it does make sense because this means that everything you do has a long-term value of it. May it be investing your time or money, all of this is going to add up. None of it is going to be wiped or useless in the near future. If you are playing a game hardcore every day and night, and then comes an update or expansion where all that grinding, all that gear, everything that you gain is obsolete, that serves as a deterrent because now it feels like all their time is wasted. And so when you know an expansion or something is dropping where all this stuff is going to happen, you're going to be demotivated to do anything in the game. Why put in all that time when it's not going to matter in the long term? Now here's the thing. Evergreen MMOs have a habit of doing really well or good at the launch and then they fall off pretty hard. Now don't get it twisted, this is normal to lose players over time. It is unrealistic to think the game is going to launch big and stay with that same amount of player base. The launch is going to be everybody interested in the game and then you're going to be left with your core audience. A lot of people are going to try the game and then they're going to decide if it is for them or not. And I do believe the Evergreen design is a big factor to why a lot of people turn away from the game. There are of course other reasons. Paired with Evergreen games is often freemium games, and we've already talked about this on the channel on how freemium games really change MMOs. And I do believe these have become the catalyst for a decline in MMOs. And I do think the numbers speak for themselves as the most popular games, at least in the West, is going to be World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. Games that are monthly subs, expansion based. While they do have microtransactions, they are not freemium and they are not evergreen. So as you probably expected, we are going to be using Lost Ark as a prime example of some of this. The player count of Lost Ark drops. There are a few moments in time where we see pretty big player gain jumps from either new players or people coming back to the game. And so now we're here at like 3 years with being 31k players with a 1.3 million peak, which now leaves us at 3 years later going from a 1.3 million peak to a 31k peak. Again, it is normal for people to quit the game, but the goal is for more people to join and replace those people. However, your freemium evergreen game is commonly just unfriendly for new players. The longer the game is out, the more content that is added, the more players will have to catch up on. People who play at launch don't really understand this as well because they didn't have to go through it. Their experience was everybody was going through story together and then they were starting off endgame together and then they started to wait for the next raid and next raid and the next raid. Your average launch player doesn't never have that feeling of being behind. And even if they do feel a little behind, it's not years behind. But when somebody joins the game months to years later, suddenly you had to go through that amount of times worth of content just to get towards the end game, the game that people are most interested into. So for example, if you use 0 power passes and go through a natural level character in Lost Ark, you have to go through all the vertical content. So you're going to have to level up Vulcan, Ficus, Clown, Brels, Kyangle, Akan, Ivory Tower, Thamine, Echidna, Behemoth. You're going to have to get all those materials between them. You're going to have to get all your books. You have to deal with all these power systems just to get to tier 4 and then catch up on tier 4 itself. And that is basically just to get to rat status, where people are still going to be pretty wary about taking you into parties. While you can go through most of tier 3 with solo raids, at tier 4 you're just going to be at the mercy of Party Finder. A potential new player who saw a cool clip or a stream online who wants to experience the endgame or whatever they saw, even if they start during an event or power pass, the amount of things they're going to have to learn are going to be extremely overwhelming. And this will still only be partially of the way there. There's going to be an extremely dense learning curve because again, you are skipping through years of content. You have years of content to catch up on. So there are going to be a lot of missing gaps of knowledge and also just fundamentals in how the game works. And let's be honest, we live in the day and age of short form content. If you've gotten to this point in the video, you're in the minority. There are dead ass videos who say wait for it or wait for the end on videos that are only 10 to 15 seconds long. But what I'm saying is these are not the type of people who are going to commit to a game like this. They're most likely going to be like, well, I don't want to deal with all that. They're going to close this game, uninstall, and probably go play Fortnite with Goku and Miku. With this also usually comes a big time commitment and grinding. These power systems were designed to sustain people and keep people interacting with the game between releases of major content releases. There's never going to be really a time where you are done with a current endgame content. There's only going to be a time when it is replaced with newer content. While there will eventually be some nerfs to mechanics and systems over time and make them a little easier, there are limits to how much they can nerf them. Because if you make it too easy, then it doesn't feel like it's an evergreen system. It doesn't feel like it's an evergreen game. Your legacy evergreen enjoyer will not feel good if other people have a lot easier time than them. because to them, this feels like their time, their investment was all invalidated because the system just got easier. However, this is a feeling, that sentiment, that tends to taper down with how long or how old the content is or the power system. Back in the day of Clown and Lost Ark, if people got their set bonus in a week, there would be a lot of people angry that they had to spend a couple weeks to do it, and some people are just getting it now for free, basically. In modern day, getting that set is still part of your natural progression route. You're going to have to get it from Vault and Vicus. However, now the content is so old that people don't care about it. This is a main factor why level boosts and things like that don't go straight to the end game. They have to go far enough back to a point where people don't really care that things were skipped. So basically, it's designed to get you near the end game, but not exactly to it. Especially in a game like Lost Ark, when there are really horrible systems like Elixir and Transcendence, they didn't really want to nerf them too much because of Evergreen. Elixirs went through a series of minor nerfs because it was still a new system, but all the dedicated and hardcore players already invested all their gold into getting proper elixirs when it was at its worst. Had they done this change a lot earlier, people would have been pretty upset. It really becomes that system of the legacy players who have been around don't want to see other people have an easier time than they had it. It's as if they had their life with a Flintstone car and then suddenly people have motors and now they're pissed. I went through all this, I struggled, I had to do this, so there's no reason why they can't do it. That's the kind of mentality you see with a lot of people who hate nerfs to older systems. Even if they're completely done with the system, they don't want to see it happen. And it's this mentality that comes with Evergreen that just is self-destructive. Players are unknowingly or just ignorantly killing their own game that they claim to love, because they are fighting to make their game even more niche than it already is. Because all this does is make the game more and more unapproachable for a newer player. And it's not like this is only bad for new players. For the veteran players, for the legacy players, for launch players, this kind of comes at a fault too. The design of these games tend to lead to natural burnout for a lot of people. Because the content is evergreen and freemium, there is no endpoint of your content. There is always just a forever grind because all your currency and materials that you're gathering just keeps on adding up. You're always going to need these things, so there's never a stopping point. It isn't like a World of Warcraft raid where you get all your loot and you can just fuck off for a while. So then it creates this I have to play job mentality. This just leads to burnout, people quitting, and then people who take a break and then decide, well, actually, I'm just going to keep on this break and just quit the game. Now, while not mutually exclusive to Evergreen, monetization does play a huge role in this as well. The most obvious thing is these games are loaded with microtransactions, pay to win. When people are dropping a bunch of money into a character to progress it, they'll be quote unquote investing into it. They're dropping their money into the game because they feel like this is going to go for a long run. This isn't money being put into something that's going to be invalidated. The higher you hone in a game like Lost Ark means the higher your hones are going to be when you transfer up. Compared to a non-evergreen game, if you're playing and getting all your gear in WoW Vanilla, that gear is going to be pretty useless in TBC because it's going to just be outdone by a lot of leveling gear. So comparatively, when people are throwing their money into an evergreen game, they don't feel like they're wasting their money because it is going towards their forever progression on that character. And since a lot of monetization, a lot of the money that is spent on the game generally comes from a small group of concentrated players that are just big whales, this leads to developers who do not want to upset those people. They want to keep those people on the track. Now let's talk a little bit about the competition, which is games with hard resets. In a lot of other games, they come with expansions. And so what this does is it makes the ideal jumping in point for newer players to try and play the game. This is putting the community, new and old, at the closest thing to on par with one another as possible. While in a game like World of Warcraft, a hardcore raider will have an easier time in the earlier zones, probably about halfway through the expansion, them and the newer players are going to be wearing the same questing gear basically. Obviously, it's not always halfway. This does change expansion of just how they balance things. The point is, however, this is the closest they'll get to everybody being on the same starting point. Versus, say, a progression event in an evergreen game. You're only pushing players towards the end game faster. You're not getting them to the end game. They're not still interacting with the end game. They're not caught up in all the other systems. WoW and FF14 have really big player jumps when an expansion releases. And it's not only because a new player is being interested in the game, but also it brings a lot of people back who maybe faded out during the middle of the expansion because they did everything they wanted to do. And they understood that, hey, I don't have to keep playing this game if I don't really want to. I can just come back later. There's no detriment for me to do that. As opposed to an evergreen game where you, even if you don't really want to play, but you still want to play in the future, you're waiting for the new content. You have to play the current content to keep yourself kind of up to speed. Because the game is designed to keep you farming those materials or whatever you're doing. Well, years ago, Yoshi P was talking about how you should take a break if you're feeling burned out and play other games. Him being the director of Final Fantasy XIV. And then Throne and Liberty is kind of like in its own Like, it is like a very hardcore freemium pay to win game, but they decided to put in an expansion, and they are getting a jump in players. But I think that community probably gets more burned out of the pay to win aspects. But I do respect them for attempting to do the expansion type while embodying still all this free to play stuff. And really, the game design of the game felt very evergreenish until they found out there were gear resets actually. With all these things combined, it just seems like a pretty clear picture that these evergreen games is just self-destructive. It's a non-stop grind that eventually burns out the existing players, and because it just keeps on adding on systems and everything you had to learn, it makes it really hard for a newer player to get into the game. The launch and legacy players have a hard time understanding this because they didn't have to experience that. They got to experiencing things as they released. And the experience they had going through the content as it launched is going to be a completely different experience than somebody going through the content today. Vaulton to me is one of the best experiences I've ever had in MMOs. I think it is one of the best designed fights, and it's just super unique, and I just really loved it. And a lot of people love that fight. However, now the people who start the game today, if they go to Vaulton, they're going to be doing it in a solo raid because the content is just dead in groups. On top of that, the game has just completely changed to become completely different. Characters are more powerful, and just nobody's going to have the same experience now as they would back then. The Vaulton experience will just never be the same. If you've ever played World of Warcraft, it's like doing a vanilla dungeon when you're in TBC. You had to take the dungeon pretty slow in vanilla, but in the later expansions, you could just blaze through it and grab everything you want. And because we don't get a lot of new players, it's really hard to simulate that kind of new player experience. Because for a lot of new players, they're going to feel like, besides when they're in town, that it's basically a one-player game. Like, there's nobody else around besides maybe a group of bots. The low level and natural progression experience would be a lot better if there was a lot of people in that area still going through it. And that's just not the case, and even Smilegate acknowledges it because that's why we have solo raids. And this is really why I think that Evergreen MMOs don't stay in the spotlight for long. While these games don't outright die or go to end of service, it becomes a niche community of basically whales that they're just continuing to milk because they're funding the game. And because of this, people just accept that this is the status quo. And I do want to say that when people talk about like the big three MMOs, the third one generally is OSRS. I'm going to be honest, I don't know much about it. I think it is Evergreen. So maybe it is the exception of an Evergreen game that is actually still very popular. So if you are an OSRS player, educate me in the comments. Yeah. But overall, I understand the interest and allure of a Evergreen game. However, how we see it currently implemented in MMOs, it actually prevents them from being the first letter of MMO, which is massive. And at the end of the day, I do think a lot of it does come down to monetization because they just want to focus on milking some big whales. Anyways, this is a longer yap. I try to cut myself 10 minutes because I just don't like editing. So that'll be it for this week. Let me know in the comments kind of what you think about Evergreen games. What do you like or dislike about them?